We read this morning from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians, and she had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha Cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Just before dawn, on my very first night on call as a hospital chaplain, I was called to the pediatric intensive care unit where a 6-year-old girl was fighting for her life. Later, the parents went into the child's room, and I waited in the hallway with the grandparents, searching for something of comfort in that awful moment. I opened my Bible to Mark and read the grandparents the story of Jairus' daughter. The words seemed right at the time. The divine story seemed to embrace the story of this moment. There was Jairus, the synagogue leader, broken and begging, "My little daughter is at the point of death." There was Jesus, calm and confident, "The child is not dead, but sleeping." And there was his brief, urgent command, "Talitha Cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." More than all of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, much more than the extended prayers in the Gospel of John, these few words in Aramaic convey what feels like a first-hand experience of Jesus. The moment is urgent, and the experience is intense. It's even strange, isn't it? I'm not sure what Jairus or anyone else expected Jesus to do at that point. The crowds around Jesus had seen many demons exorcised and many people healed of disease, but they had never seen him urge life where it appeared no life was left. Wasn't it strange then for Jesus to say, "Little girl, get up, to a child who had died. How does that even make sense? Talitha Cum. They seemed like the right words when I read them to the grandparents, but today I wonder. Because unlike the little girl in the story, the child on my call shift died. Our passionate prayers did not save her life. Invoking the story of Jairus' daughter to write this child's story into the divine story and remind us of God's power to heal did not save her life. This child died. I cannot imagine how that felt and how it still feels 4 years later to her family. I will probably never read the story of Jairus' daughter without thinking about those grandparents. I wonder how they felt later about Talitha Cum. Little girl, get up. Those words make so much sense in the context of a gospel miracle. They made sense in the hospital at that moment, capturing our hearts and our hopes and putting them in Jesus' very mouth. But did they lose their sense for the grandparents when this little girl died? Do Jesus' words have meaning now for the family of a little girl who did not get up? Our faith is based on a great story, and stories are made of words. We seek to know Jesus by studying what is revealed in words about Jesus and words of Jesus, especially words of Jesus. Words attributed to Jesus himself are a very small part of the New Testament, but they carry great weight. Sometimes their weight is a comfort so solid when we need reassurance. But sometimes the weight might even be a burden, because sometimes the words of Jesus are not in accord with what we mortals experience on this earth. And when that happens, they might hang heavy as we try to make sense of them. We really have to have sense, because words without sense are words without meaning. Ask the disciples, especially in the Gospel of Mark, where the disciples are almost perpetually unable to make sense of Jesus' words. And we sympathize because the words of Jesus are so often strange. Simple and familiar though each word may be, together they come in odd combinations or in times and places where they catch us by surprise. Sometimes they just don't make sense. And when that happens, people object. In today's story, the disciples are the first to object. In fact, they object the minute Jesus opens his mouth, which doesn't happen till almost halfway through the story. We wait such a long time to hear Jesus' first words. We watch Jesus get out of a boat, and we watch the crowd gather. We watch Jairus approach and then fall down before him, begging Jesus to save his daughter's life. And we watch Jesus going away with Jairus toward his home. And we see the crowd following. We're told they're pressing in around Jesus. And then suddenly comes another character, the woman with the issue of blood. So we pause to hear her story, even hear her thoughts. We see her grasp at his cloak. We watch her healing take place. And now finally, we see Jesus look around, and at last he speaks his first words, "Who touched my clothes?" We've been waiting and waiting to hear from Jesus, and when he speaks his first line, it doesn't even make sense, which the disciples naturally point out. They are at pains to emphasize that Jesus' question is ridiculous. You see the crowd pressing in around you. How can you say, "Who touched me?" In the disciples' experience, when the press of a crowd is so great that presumably everybody within range has touched you, it is not possible to feel, let alone locate, any one particular touch. The disciples can't make sense of Jesus' words. And so at this moment, for the disciples, Jesus' words have no meaning. Farther down the road and farther down the page come further objections, this time from a crowd of mourners who are clustered in the house of Jairus when he and Jesus arrive. They fill the air with commotion, loud weeping and wailing from every corner, and Jesus walks right into this storm of emotion and declares that the child is not dead, but sleeping. The mourners object, and they don't bother to argue like the disciples did. Instead, see how swiftly they turn from their weeping and wailing to laugh at Jesus. Other translations say they ridiculed him, or as King James has it, they laughed him to scorn. Their laughter voices their objection. In these mourners' experience, a dead child is dead, not asleep. Jesus' words do not make sense. So at this time, for this group of mourners, the words have no meaning. Even at the moment when Jesus is standing beside the child's bed, do his words make sense? Talitha Cum. How does it make sense to insist on life when to all appearances there is no life left? It does not make sense to command this child to get up. And yet that's what the child does, demonstrating that in spite of all appearances to the contrary, life persists. By rising, the child makes sense of Jesus' words. It is the miracle that gives his words their meaning. The same must have been true for who touched me. When the woman fell down before Jesus, the disciples saw that miraculously he really did feel that one touch. The same must have been true for the child is not dead but sleeping. As soon as the mourners heard that miraculously the child lived, then the words made sense. In the context of a miracle, Jesus' words make all the sense in the world. But what about that dawn at Baptist Hospital? The miracle that family wanted to see and I wanted to see did not come. Did the family wind up feeling that Jesus' words were meaningless? I hope not. But I do understand how that could happen. Loss of life feels like loss of sense. Even for people of great faith, an overwhelming tragedy can sweep the meaning out of everything we know and believe. Sometimes heartbroken people will act like the mourners in Jairus' house, weeping and wailing one moment, and the next turning on Jesus to laugh him to scorn. You can understand how that could happen. People object to something that seems without sense. Without the miracle they pray for, even faithful people can have trouble making meaning. Talitha Cum, Jesus tells the dead to rise. Where in this life of ordinary tragedy is the extraordinary miracle that gives meaning to that command? Of course, we acknowledge that our dead do rise into the more immediate presence of Christ. But on this side of heaven, perhaps the miracle is that we, the living, also rise, even when we feel there is no life left in us. Tragedy happens and it knocks us flat. Suffering takes all the stuffing out of us. We feel that we cannot possibly get up ever again. And yet eventually we do. And that in itself can feel like a miracle. But we rise because we can, and we can because God wills it. God's persistent will for us to live and live fully makes sense of Christ's command to get up. And so even when we feel most lifeless, we do hear him calling, and we do get up day after day. God's constant and urgent desire for each of us to be fully alive is the miracle that gives meaning to everything. As members of the church, we have a crucial role in proclaiming this message, this miracle, that God is for us, that God desires life for us. Where tragedy and loss and suffering have left hearts so battered that it seems no life remains, we must be present to proclaim that life persists through the persistent will of God. Theologian Marjorie Suhaki defines the church as that people called in and through Jesus Christ to be a sign of God's holy and gracious reign. As that sign, it is our calling to take the hands of the world in the most lifeless seeming places and say with the urgency of Jesus, "Get up." Little girl, little boy, get up. Man, woman, teenager, rise. Victim of tragedy, you can get up. You who have lost so much, there is more life for you. Suffering people, you can rise because God desires it for you. I think that many people these days reject the gift of faith because in the face of suffering and tragedy, they can't make sense of what they know about religion, so they object. In the face of their objections, we, the church, are called to manifest the love of God as the miracle that makes the meaning. It is our urgent responsibility, and it is no more urgent than in the places or in the hearts where there seems to be no life left. Whenever we take a hand and say, "Rise," we help the world to make sense of Talitha Cum. When we demonstrate that life persists because of God's love for us, we help the world to make sense of Jesus. God's love is a miracle that we ourselves can reveal. And in the context of that miracle, Jesus' words make all the sense in the world. Hallelujah. Amen.